Hello, friend. If you've landed here, chances are it's late, or at least late enough for your mind to whisper, just put something on to drift away. So, settle in. Wiggle your toes. Let your jaw unclench. Maybe slide one sock down, just a little for no reason other than it feels right. Tonight, you're not just getting a bedtime story, you're getting a slow, surprising look into the weird sleep habits of medieval people. We're exploring how bedtime once meant communal piles of straw, shoes as pillows, nighttime beer breaks, and even monks waking up to chant at 2 a.m. A reality so strangely intimate and wildly different, and yet oddly human. If that sounds like your kind of story, feel free to like and subscribe. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always comforting to see who's drifting off across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's begin. What if your sleep was interrupted on purpose every single night? What if you snuggled up not in a plush bed, but on hay next to your siblings or your goats? What if dreams were considered spiritual messages, and a full bladder might literally keep you out of heaven? In this episode, we're going deep into the peculiar, poorly lit, and often pungent world of medieval sleep, a time before blackout curtains, lavender sprays, or ergonomic pillows. Sleep wasn't just sleep, it was a whole way of life. People in the Middle Ages didn't snooze the way we do today. They slept in two chunks, sometimes rising at midnight to think, pray, snack, or make babies before heading back to bed. There were no mattresses as we know them instead. People curled up in bundles of hay or itchy wool blankets, often fully clothed, shoes nearby, and sometimes in beds shared with family or strangers. But it wasn't just the setting, it was the beliefs. Sleep was spiritual, practical, and communal. Nighttime came with rituals and fears, from warding off demons to watching for death in one's dreams. And all of this happened in a world lit only by moonlight and tallow candles, where sleep could be a sacred act or a brief respite from sheer exhaustion. So if you've ever tossed and turned wondering what people did before Tempur-Pedic, melatonin gummies, or Spotify sleep playlists, tonight we'll uncover just how inventive, bizarre, and deeply human medieval sleep could be. Because when you dim the torches and silence the chickens, it turns out everyone, even a peasant in 1297, just wanted a little peace and quiet before drifting off. What if I told you that sleeping in one long stretch is a modern invention? That for centuries, people believed the healthiest way to rest was to wake up halfway through the night? It might sound strange, but for much of medieval Europe, sleep came in two acts, known simply as first sleep and second sleep. Across medieval writings, from medical treatises to private letters, references to this unusual habit appear again and again. People didn't lie down at 10 p.m. and wake at 7 a.m. Instead, they'd tuck themselves in shortly after sundown, say around 9 or 10, and drift off into what was called the first sleep. This initial phase lasted for about 4 hours. Then, like clockwork, they would wake up, often feeling alert, thoughtful, or even energized. This wasn't insomnia, this was normal. And here's the strangest part. They would intentionally stay awake for an hour or two before returning to bed. That second stretch of sleep, known appropriately as the second sleep, would then carry them into the early morning until sunrise, when roosters cried, and the day began again. It wasn't just the peasants either. Everyone from nuns in monasteries to kings in castles followed this pattern. And they didn't find it disruptive. They found it useful. Modern sleep researchers like Roger E. Kirch believed that this two-part slumber wasn't a medieval quirk. It was likely the default human sleep pattern for thousands of years. Long before electric light stretched our evenings late into the night, people followed the rhythms of sunset and sunrise. Without artificial light to suppress melatonin production, the human brain would naturally fall asleep early, then wake again, mid-cycle, before settling in for more rest. This intermission wasn't a bug, it was a feature. What did people do in that midnight window? Well, quite a bit. People talked. Sometimes with others in bed, sometimes with themselves. One 15th century text describes it as a good time to think of one's dreams and thank God for the quiet. Others used this peaceful break to pray, especially in religious communities where night vigils were built into the schedule. Some wrote in journals, tended to the fire, or even snuck out for secret meetings. There's evidence that many considered this the ideal time for physical intimacy, with medical texts recommending that couples be together after first sleep, when the body was well rested, but not too tired. Romantic, in a weirdly logistical way. Others simply walked about the house, checked on children, or visited the privy, not the most romantic. If you were rich, perhaps you read by candlelight. If you were poor, perhaps you simply sat in the dark pondering dreams, future plans, or the scraping noises in your rafters. It was a quiet, gentle time. Less about productivity, more about presence. Think of that moment when you wake at 3:12 a.m. You blink at the ceiling. Your mind wanders. You check the time, curse your brain, and beg yourself to fall asleep again. What if that moment, that exact sliver of consciousness, wasn't a flaw, but a relic? A long-forgotten piece of ancestral rhythm, reminding you that for most of human history, waking up at night wasn't strange. It was sacred. In the Middle Ages, the night was not a solid wall of unconsciousness. It was porous, meandering a time for reflection, not interruption. And perhaps, in this world of blue light screens and midnight emails, we might do well to learn from that rhythm again. Ever wonder what people wore to bed before pajama pants, sleep masks, or fuzzy socks? Spoiler, it wasn't much and often. It was what they'd worn all day. Pajamas, as a specific category of nightwear, didn't really exist in the Middle Ages. The word itself is Persian in origin payame, meaning leg garment, and didn't enter Western wardrobes until centuries later via colonial trade. Instead, medieval folks simply slept in their undergarments, which, to be clear, were a far cry from anything cozy. For most commoners, this meant a long linen shirt, often called a chemise for women, or a nightshirt, though not always worn just at night, for men. Made from coarse, homespun linen, this was the innermost layer, absorbing sweat and body oils, and sparing their outer garments from grime. The richer you were, the cleaner your chemise, but even then, laundering was rare, and many people slept in the same garment for days, and some didn't bother with a shirt at all. Numerous historical accounts mention sleeping starkers. In some households, especially among the poor, nudity in bed was practical, not provocative. Clothes were expensive. Lice were a problem, and one's garments might be hung up or aired out overnight, while the body rested, unclothed, under scratchy wool blankets. But remember, this wasn't the privacy of a modern bedroom. Most people shared beds, often with family, servants, or even strangers in inns or taverns. So yes, nudity was sometimes the norm, but so was communal sleeping, and that added a layer of etiquette. For instance, many towns enforced modesty laws. You might be fined for being found outside in your nightshirt, as it was considered the same as being in your underwear. A nightshirt was intimate, domestic, never for public display. For the elite, there were more options. Wealthier nobles might wear embroidered sleeping gowns, often lined with fur in winter months. Queen Elizabeth I was said to have nightgowns of velvet and damask, though these were less for sleeping and more for lounging in bed, especially since royal beds were semi-public spaces. Yes, you read that right. In royal courts, it wasn't unusual for important courtiers or ambassadors to visit the king or queen while they were in bed, sipping wine or giving updates. This wasn't scandalous, it was ceremonial. So, sleepwear had to walk the line between intimacy and presentation. And monks? Their bedclothes were usually just their robes, repurposed. Some orders even avoided undressing at all, not out of modesty, but piety. Comfort was viewed with suspicion. A scratchy robe meant humility. Meanwhile, in homes with fewer religious obligations, sleeping in your shirt, or with nothing at all, was simply practical minimalism. Today, we have an entire sleep economy, from satin pajamas to sleep-tracking smart rings. But in the medieval world, sleep was just another function of daily life, not something to accessorize. There's something charming in the simplicity. You took off your shoes, maybe loosened your belt, and lay down. That was enough. And yet, there's also something revealing about the blurred lines between daywear and nightwear. It reflects how blurred life itself was. No separate wardrobes, no separate rooms. Work and rest, public and private, often existed in the same breath. Maybe the question isn't, what did they wear to sleep? Maybe it's, when did anyone in the Middle Ages truly get to feel alone? If you could time travel back to a medieval night, where exactly would you lay your head? Spoiler, it probably wouldn't be on a mattress, and definitely not alone. Let's start with a mythbuster. Most people in the Middle Ages didn't have beds the way we imagine them today. Sure, nobles and the wealthy had grand wooden bed frames with carved posts, feather mattresses, and embroidered canopies, but the average person? Their sleeping arrangement might be better described as a soft corner of the floor. In rural cottages, peasants often slept on piles of straw or rush mats laid over earthen floors. If you were lucky, the straw might be stuffed into a sack, creating something like a rudimentary mattress. But often, it was just loose straw, mixed with dried herbs like lavender or sweet hay to mask odors and deter pests. And even that was aspirational for some. Travelers, laborers, and servants might simply curl up on benches, hearthstones, or in barns, using cloaks or satchels for pillows. Your boots? Tucked under your head, or under your blanket to keep them from being stolen. Wood was valuable. Crafting a bed frame wasn't just about luxury, it was a serious investment. So, in many households, a single bed might serve an entire family. In a typical one-room peasant home, you might find parents, children, and even grandparents sleeping together, tucked under shared blankets or furs. The idea of a private bed didn't exist for most. Even in inns and lodging houses, bed sharing was normal. Travelers often had to share beds with complete strangers, and not just because of crowding. In colder climates, body heat was part of the appeal. Some innkeepers charged by the blanket or by the half bed. Want the edge? That'll cost extra. In one English account from the 14th century, a traveller laments paying twopence to share a lumpy straw bed with a peddler and a shepherd, one who snored like a sow and the other who smelled like one. Sleeping arrangements weren't always dictated by preference. They were shaped by status, gender, and necessity. In noble homes, servants often slept at the foot of their lord's bed or on pallets nearby, ready to be summoned. Children were nestled in wherever space allowed, sometimes in trundle beds pulled out at night. Monasteries used dormitory-style layouts, where rows of monks slept in narrow beds, following strict rules of silence and posture. Some were even instructed to sleep sitting upright to avoid sin. Then there were the inns and taverns, where the phrase, "stranger in your bed," was literal. Shared sleeping was a feature of public lodging, and guests might be assigned space with whomever arrived next, regardless of social class. Want solitude? That was a luxury only the rich could afford, and even then the silence might be broken by the creaking of floorboards, the dripping of wax candles, or the scratching of rats nearby. It's easy to take our modern sleeping privacy for granted, our lockable bedrooms, climate-controlled air, and noise machines. But for most of human history, sleep wasn't solitary. It was social. There was comfort in the presence of others, warmth, familiarity, even safety from nocturnal threats. But there was also tension, the snoring, the smells, the lack of space to stretch out. Still, this shared intimacy reflected a world where individual privacy barely existed. From bathing, to eating, to sleeping, life was communal. And maybe that's why so many bedtime prayers from the period focus not on personal rest, but on communal protection. Guard us as we sleep, they'd say, and keep the fire from catching the thatch. Because when one person stirred, everyone else probably did too. What if the scariest part of the night wasn't the dark, but what might come with it? In a world before locks and electric lights, bedtime didn't always mean safety. When we imagine quiet, we often think of silence. But in the medieval world, quiet was a relative concept. As dusk settled, village life did slow carts, ceased clattering down muddy roads, blacksmiths banked their fires, and market stalls shuttered. But night brought its own symphony. In rural areas, the sounds of owls, wolves, and rustling leaves were constant companions. Dogs might bark at passing shadows. Cows stirred in barns. Chickens squawked uneasily on the roost. And inside, you'd hear people breathing, babies fussing, beds creaking, someone snoring like a distant bear. Even in monasteries, famed for their discipline, the stillness of the night was punctuated by the ringing of bells calling monks to midnight prayers. But it wasn't just the sounds that kept people on edge. It was the sense that the night belonged to other things. The Middle Ages were steeped in a worldview where the dark was dangerous, not just physically, but spiritually. According to medieval belief, nighttime was the devil's playground. Demons, witches, and wandering spirits were thought to be most active under the cover of darkness. Dreams were believed to be windows to the soul, or even portals for sin. Priests warned of succubi and incubi demonic figures who would visit people as they slept, draining them of energy and purity. Sleep paralysis, now recognized as a neurological phenomenon, was often interpreted as a demon pressing on your chest. People responded to these fears in both religious and folk ways. Crucifixes were hung above beds. Prayers were whispered before lying down. Some even placed iron objects under pillows to ward off evil, believing that spirits feared the strength of forged metal. The wealthy might sleep with candles burning all night, not just for comfort, but as a spiritual light against darkness. The poor, unable to afford that luxury, relied on holy charms, herbs like rosemary, or carved wooden figures of saints. Aside from spiritual threats, there were practical dangers too. In a time of wooden homes and open flames, fire was a constant fear. A single overturned candle, or a hearth left untended, could burn down an entire thatched roof village. So, bedtime wasn't just about getting horizontal, it meant making rounds, checking embers, covering coals with ash, ensuring no sparks remained. Then there were the bandits and thieves. Locked doors were rare, and windows were often little more than shutters. In poorer areas, sleeping with one eye open wasn't a phrase, it was common sense. It's no wonder that people said evening prayers like, "Lord, shield this house from flame and foe, from creeping shade and shadows woe." And for those sleeping in crowded inns or stables, the fear wasn't ghosts, it was lice, fleas, or someone nicking your boots while you dreamed. We tend to forget that sleep requires trust. Trust that nothing will harm us while we're unconscious. Trust that the world will still be there when we wake. In the Middle Ages, that trust was fragile. Night was uncertain, unpredictable. The fire might spread. The cow might calve. The baby might stop breathing. The demon might visit. So sleep was often cautious, rarely deep, and never guaranteed. Even the phrase, "sleep like the dead," would have felt different in a world where death came often and quietly in the night. And yet, people still slept, still dreamed, still found ways to rest their bones in the straw and breathe softly beneath woolen blankets. There's something almost heroic in that. So now that we've heard the creaks and whispers of the medieval night, let's step into another strange aspect of their slumber. Why did so many people wake up in the middle of the night feeling refreshed, In Chapter 5, we'll explore the midnight gap and why that mysterious waking hour was the most sacred part of sleep. What if waking up at 1:45 a.m. wasn't a problem but a gift? For medieval people, that odd hour between two sleeps wasn't lost time, it was sacred. By now you know that medieval sleep often came in two parts. First sleep, then second sleep. But what did people actually do in between? That quiet, wakeful period, usually lasting 1 to 2 hours, was sometimes called the watch. Far from being an annoyance, it was a treasured pause, where the world felt suspended and private. This midnight gap wasn't spent tossing and turning. Instead, it was used intentionally as a time for introspection, connection, even creativity. It was a time to stretch, to sip, to speak, to love, to pray, and, just maybe, to be alone with one's thoughts in the stillest hours of the night. Historical diaries, medical texts, and religious writings from the 9th to the 17th century all reference this gap as a known part of daily life. English physician Robert Burton, writing in the 1600s, casually refers to the midnight hour as the quietest and most contemplative time of all. Italian peasant letters describe waking around midnight to stoke the coals, whisper prayers, and hold my wife. Even Chaucer hints at it in the Canterbury Tales, when characters are awake between sleeps, gossiping, flirting, or attending to nature's calls. In monasteries, this gap wasn't just spiritual, it was structured. Monks were often woken purposefully around midnight to chant the matins, a set of holy prayers reserved for the most devout. Some abbeys even rang a bell to call brothers from bed into candlelit chapels for their nocturnal devotions. This wasn't insomnia, this was design. So how exactly did people use this time? 1. Prayer and reflection. Many used it as a window for spiritual clarity, believing that the veil between the physical and divine worlds was thinnest in the midnight hush. 2. Reading and writing. For those who were literate and had access to light, this was often when they read scripture or kept journals. A candle, a quill, and an undisturbed hour? Bliss. 3. Talking and whispering. Bedmates might quietly converse, discussing dreams, daily plans, or worries. These moments of half-awake honesty could be the most intimate of all. 4. Eating and drinking. Yes, some households even ate snacks during this time. Warm ale or leftover stew might be reheated. This wasn't indulgent, it was restorative. 5. Sex and affection. Multiple sources, including physicians and theologians, recommend the midnight gap as the most favorable time for intimacy. The body, they claimed, was well rested, but not yet sluggish with deep sleep. Some even believed this improved fertility. Imagine, it's 1:20 a.m. You've just stirred from first sleep, and instead of fretting, you quietly smile, light a small flame, and begin your real night. Today, if we wake at 2 a.m., we panic, we fumble for our phones, search, why can't I sleep, and dread the fatigue we'll feel the next morning. But what if that panic is modern and misguided? Medieval people accepted and even celebrated the idea that rest comes in waves, that a night broken into parts isn't broken at all, that being awake at night isn't failure, it's opportunity. Some sleep researchers argue that our natural circadian rhythm may still carry remnants of this biphasic cycle, explaining why so many of us wake in the dark and feel weirdly alert. Instead of reaching for melatonin, perhaps we could reach for meaning the way people once reached for a candle, a companion, or a whispered prayer. The midnight gap wasn't lost sleep, it was found time. But not every part of medieval sleep was so tranquil. In Chapter 6, we'll explore the dream world, what medieval people believed their dreams meant, how they interpreted them, and the odd rituals they used to encourage or avoid certain visions. Because for them, sleep wasn't just for the body, it was a doorway for the soul. What if your dreams weren't random? What if they were messages from God, demons, or your own sinful thoughts? In the medieval world, sleep wasn't just a time to rest. It was a time to receive revelations. Unlike our modern view of dreams as subconscious noise or psychological puzzles, medieval people saw dreams as meaningful and often divine. Dreams could be prophetic, they could be warnings, they could reveal secret sins or future salvation. This belief stretched across all levels of society. From popes to peasants, people kept an eye on what they saw in sleep, and some even wrote them down, trying to decode their messages like divine riddles. The great thinkers of the Middle Ages, from St. Augustine to Thomas Aquinas, weighed in heavily on the subject. Augustine cautioned that dreams might be temptations from the devil, while Aquinas distinguished between natural dreams, caused by food or fatigue, divine dreams, and demonic deceptions. So yes, your weird, cheese-fueled dream about talking chickens might have been cause for concern. The medieval mindset wasn't created in a vacuum. Dream interpretation was a fusion of ancient, religious, and folk traditions. The Bible is filled with prophetic dreams. Think Joseph's dreams of famine and plenty in Egypt, or Daniel's vision of beasts. Medieval Christians inherited these ideas, believing that sleep was a state in which God could speak to the soul. At the same time, Greek and Roman thinkers like Hippocrates and Artemidorus had laid out extensive dream manuals, categorizing every possible vision: dreaming of water, emotional unrest, flying, a desire for freedom, being naked in public, beware exposure in more ways than one. These ancient texts were copied and adapted into medieval dream books, which became surprisingly common, passed down within monasteries, merchant households, and even among traveling minstrels. Some people even slept with specific dream pillows, stuffed with herbs like mugwort, chamomile, or vervain, believed to enhance dreams or protect the sleeper from dark visions. Here's how it might go. You dream of your deceased mother standing at the foot of your bed, whispering a name. The next morning, you consult a dream book. It tells you, this is a visitation, a warning. Someone in your household may be in danger. You write it down, maybe even tell your priest. If it feels serious enough, you might fast or offer a candle at church. On the other hand, if you dream of eating ripe fruit, it could be a sign of prosperity or temptation, depending on the context. Dreams were rarely interpreted in isolation. The sleeper's character, location, recent sins, and even the moon phase all played a role. For example, dreaming of running through the woods could mean you are fleeing temptation, or that you are being called to a spiritual path. A black dog might represent demonic presence. A bright light in the sky, possibly a divine sign, or indigestion from that onion stew. There was even advice on how to dream better. Sleep on your right side. Keep your heart elevated. Avoid meat before bed. Say a prayer, and place a clean cloth over your eyes. Some mystics claimed to induce holy dreams by reciting Latin verses as they fell asleep, entering a kind of lucid, sacred vision. Today, we might keep dream journals for fun. In the Middle Ages, dreams were moral documents, psychological confessions, and even warnings of death. But beneath the superstition lies a powerful truth. Medieval people believed that sleep could connect them to something greater than themselves. To dream was to touch something ineffable. The veil between body and soul grew thinner in slumber, making the dreamscape both a playground and a battlefield. And in a world where so little was known for certain about the body, the mind, or the cosmos, dreams were a place to explore possibility. A quiet canvas, painted in candlelit symbols, where every strange animal or whispered voice might just matter. Maybe it still does. Imagine settling in for the night knowing you'll be cold, itchy, possibly bitten, and still exhausted in the morning. In the Middle Ages, comfort wasn't expected. It was a luxury. We often romanticize the past with images of grand four-posters draped in velvet and silk. And yes, those existed if you were royal or very rich. But for most people, sleep took place on something that resembled a giant sack stuffed with hay, reeds, or even moss. These were often called pallets, and were either laid directly on the floor or on crude wooden frames. Feather beds existed too, but again they were expensive. A mattress full of goose down could cost as much as a small farm animal. And keeping it clean? Another challenge altogether. And that's just the bedding. Pillows were rare. Many simply used a folded cloak or a pair of boots under the head. Sheets, if they existed, were often just lengths of rough linen, rarely washed, and deeply scratchy. And blankets, usually woolen, heavy, and coarse, better for trapping heat than for comfort. Without central heating or insulation, temperature control was a fantasy. In winter, homes got cold bitterly so. Many slept fully clothed, wrapping cloaks around themselves, or bundling under layers of animal pelts. In wealthier homes, beds were surrounded by curtains not just for privacy, but to trap body heat in a small space. Chroniclers often mention ice forming on the inside of windows and breath misting in the air indoors. People even described waking up with frost on their eyelashes. In poor homes, where the hearth was the only source of warmth, entire families, and sometimes their livestock, might sleep in the same room to share heat. During summer, well, things got damp and sticky. Mosquitoes, fleas, sweat-drenched straw. Comfort, in the modern sense, wasn't the goal. Getting through the night without freezing or itching yourself raw. That was enough. Let's talk about pests because they were part of the bedtime routine. Beds were often full of fleas, lice, and bedbugs, especially in inns, barracks, and poor households. To manage this, people stuffed mattresses with herbs like wormwood or lavender, believed to repel insects, smoked out bedding by waving it over fire or hanging it near hearths, slept with clothes off to avoid lice hiding in garments, though this had other risks. Or, if rich, hired servants to beat and air out bedding before sleep. Still, bites were inevitable. As for back pain, it was likely considered a normal part of life. There was no memory foam, no ergonomic anything. The idea of a perfect sleeping position hadn't been invented, and yet people adapted. They layered, they curled into each other, they used body heat and habit to endure. Some even warmed stones in the fire and placed them beneath the bedding as medieval hot water bottles. There's something deeply humbling in all of this. We, who obsess over thread counts and mattress firmness, might struggle to rest without white noise or blackout curtains. But the medieval sleeper expected to be uncomfortable, and so discomfort didn't always bother them. Maybe they accepted rest as something earned through fatigue. When you've worked from sunup to sundown in fields, kitchens, or workshops, even straw can feel like silk. And maybe, strangely, the communal nature of sleep, the warmth of bodies, the flicker of a dying fire, the scrape of hay under a blanket, made the experience less about comfort and more about endurance and familiarity. You didn't sleep to pamper yourself. You slept to survive. Why did some people hang garlic above their bed or mumble Latin words while pulling up the covers? In medieval times, sleep wasn't something you entered casually. It was a nightly ritual of protection. For the medieval mind, falling asleep was dangerously close to dying. You closed your eyes. You left the conscious world. You became defenseless. Your soul drifted elsewhere. And maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't come back. So bedtime wasn't just about comfort. It was about spiritual armor. The most common form of protection was prayer, often recited the same way each night. Phrases like, "From ghoulies and ghosties and long-legged beasties, and things that go bump in the night. Good Lord, deliver us." Children were taught to say protection prayers as early as they could speak. One popular version from the 14th century ends with, "If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." And that wasn't poetic flourish, that was genuine fear. Beyond prayer, folk beliefs shaped bedtime rituals, often blending Christian piety with pagan habits that lingered in rural communities. For example, Garlic was hung near the bed or under pillows to ward off illness and evil spirits. Iron nails were placed beneath mattresses or tied to the bed frame, thought to repel witches, fairies, and nighttime demons. Dreamcatcher, like charms crafted from woven twigs or knotted string, were hung above infants' cradles to protect their dreams. There were also rules about sleep position. Never sleep with your feet pointing west. That was how corpses were laid in coffins. Avoid leaving your mouth open while sleeping spirits might enter. Don't fall asleep without first crossing yourself, or the devil might slip in during the night. Even the direction your bed faced mattered. North-south was believed to promote calm dreams. East-west, unrest. Here's a reconstructed version of what a typical nightly routine could involve, especially in a superstitious countryside household around the year 1370. 1. The hearth was banked fire covered with ash to keep embers smouldering. 2. Children were tucked in with a whispered blessing from a parent, perhaps the sign of the cross traced on their forehead. 3. The family knelt together briefly, reciting the Lord's Prayer or a litany to Saint Michael, patron, saint of protection. 4. A bowl of holy water might be placed on the nightstand, if you were lucky enough to have one, or at least a small carved cross hung above the bed. 5. If dreams had been troubling lately, mugwort or rosemary was burned, its smoke fanned under the bedding. 6. Finally, as the room fell quiet, someone might whisper, "Jesu Mary, keep me still, let no dreams my spirit fill," and then into the dark, surrounded by straw, soot, breath, and belief, they closed their eyes. Today we treat bedtime as a routine of comfort. Warm lights, brushed teeth, maybe a podcast or some ambient music. But in medieval times, every night was a tiny leap of faith. Faith that your home wouldn't burn down. Faith that spirits would pass you by. Faith that you'd wake again. And maybe, behind the superstition, there's something deeply human in that. A desire to protect what cannot be fully protected. A way of taking control, however symbolically, of the unknown. Because even if garlic couldn't stop a fever, or iron couldn't repel death, these rituals gave people a sense of readiness, a feeling that they had done their part, that their family was covered, that they could sleep, if not soundly, then at least bravely. Now that we've lit our candles, said our prayers, and tucked in with protective herbs under the pillow, it's time to consider what time people actually went to bed and how early they had to rise. In Chapter 9, we'll walk through a typical medieval evening and morning and ask, when did bedtime begin? And when was it rude to still be asleep, before alarm clocks and bedtime routines? How did people know when it was time to sleep? Or worse, when it was too late to still be in bed? In the Middle Ages, there were no glowing phone screens or wristwatches. For most people, time was a feeling or a sound. Daily life followed natural rhythms, the sun, the seasons, and especially church bells. Monasteries and churches structured the day into set prayer intervals called the canonical hours, and these bells shaped sleep more than any clock ever could. At sundown, the bell would ring for Vespers evening prayer. That was often your first signal that it was time to wind down. After Vespers came Compline, the final prayer of the day. For many, this marked the moment to bank the fire, wash up as best one could, and prepare for first sleep. There was no uniform bedtime, but most people would lie down not long after darkness fell. In summer, that might be 9 or 10 p.m. In winter, closer to 6 or 7 p.m. simply because there was little else to do in the pitch dark. Waking up wasn't optional. Even if you'd had a rough night, the morning demanded movement. In cities, you might hear the first clanging of bells around 4:30 or 5 a.m. matins or lauds in monastic schedules. In farms and villages, roosters crowed, cows lowed, and the family dog began to stir. Common folk often rose before sunrise. There was bread to bake, fields to tend, animals to feed. Slipping back into bed wasn't a luxury most could afford, unless you were nobility or clergy. And even then, Sleeping in was frowned upon. Manuals on virtuous living from the period warn against slothful habits like lying abed too long. Oversleeping wasn't just lazy, it was sinful. The church reinforced this idea. The devil was said to work most actively on idle minds and idle bodies. If you weren't up and moving by sunrise, you risked more than missing breakfast. You risked being seen as morally weak. Let's imagine a day in the life of a village weaver around the year 1320. Evening, around 6:30 p.m. in winter. The family finishes their meal, often pottage and bread. Children gather around the hearth while the last of the daylight fades. The oldest daughter sweeps out the doorway to chase out spirits. The father prays aloud while mother folds clothes. Candles are snuffed, except one near the fire. Around 7:30 p.m., the family begins first sleep. It's cold. Blankets are pulled tight. Dogs curl up near the hearth. The baby is rocked with a hymn. Within minutes, the cottage is dark and nearly silent, but not for long. Around 11 p.m., 12:30 a.m., the household wakes briefly. Someone checks the fire. The father mutters a psalm. The teenage son sneaks a bite of cold bread. A moment of quiet, perhaps a shared joke or hushed conversation. Then back to second sleep. At dawn, roughly 5 a.m., the mother rises first, throwing water on the hearth coals. The father stirs the fire with a stick and opens the shutter. The world is pale blue. A new day has begun. We think of time today in digital slices, precise, numerical, relentless. But in the Middle Ages, time was experienced. You knew it was time to sleep because the chickens had settled. You woke when the light turned from black to blue. You worked until shadows grew long again. This wasn't inefficient. It was deeply intuitive. And while modern life gives us control, calendars, and countdown timers, it often robs us of that connection to our bodies, the sky, the seasons, and that subtle shift in air that whispers, "It's time." For medieval people, time was not a master, but a rhythm guided by bells, roosters, aching feet, and instinct. And as strange as it may sound, maybe they were better rested for it. Who stayed awake while the rest of the village slept? In the medieval world, the sleepless were everywhere, some by duty, some by distress, and some by divine calling. We tend to assume everyone in the Middle Ages fell asleep after dark and rose at dawn. But many people, by circumstance or design, spent long stretches of the night wide awake. And not just because of insomnia. There were monks assigned to nocturnal prayers, guards who walked town walls through the darkness, midwives attending labour, bakers stoking ovens long before sunrise, and watchmen keeping flames from consuming wooden towns. Even in the smallest villages, the night was never fully still. And of course, there were those who lay in bed unable to sleep, minds racing, limbs aching, haunted by fears or fever, staring into the pitch. They didn't have a word for insomnia, but they knew what it meant to be restless in the dark. Among the most sleep-deprived were monks and nuns, whose lives were governed by rigid prayer schedules. In Benedictine monasteries, the rule of Saint Benedict required waking at midnight or slightly later for matins, a long service of psalms and readings. This was followed by lauds, another round of morning worship, often held before sunrise. Some monks tried to nap during the day to compensate, but others slept only a few hours each night, believing that denying the body was good for the soul. Accounts describe monks dozing off in choir stalls or nodding during scripture. Fatigue was expected. In some orders, it was even virtuous. To struggle against sleep while chanting in the dark wasn't failure. It was a kind of holy battle. Not all night labour was sacred. Some was purely practical. Watchmen patrolled city gates and castle walls, guarding against fire, theft or invasion. In London, these men were assigned rotations and carried horns or wooden rattles to raise alarms. Midwives were frequently called at odd hours. Childbirth did not obey clocks. A woman in labour could summon her neighbours, priest, and birthing assistant in the dead of night. Bakers and brewers often began their work before dawn to ensure bread was ready for morning markets. In some cities, their hearths were the only ones still burning at 2 or 3 a.m. In rural homes, sleepless mothers nursed babies, comforted children, or tended to livestock giving birth. Meanwhile, there were the quietly suffering the sick, the grieving, the anxious. With no sleeping pills, no nightlights, and no white noise, the night could stretch on indefinitely. Today, we treat sleeplessness as a medical issue, a problem to be fixed with apps, routines, or prescriptions. But in the Middle Ages, being awake at night had meaning. For the religious, it might be a call to prayer. For the guilty, a sign of troubled conscience. For the fearful, evidence of spiritual unrest. If you couldn't sleep, you weren't told to count sheep. You might be told to recite psalms, to confess, or to examine your soul. Some even wrote that God kept people awake on purpose to teach them patience, or to whisper truths too quiet to hear during the day. Was it comforting? Perhaps not always, but it was interpreted, not dismissed. And in that interpretation, even insomnia gained dignity. We imagine the Middle Ages as sleepy and silent after dark, but not all candles were snuffed by sunset. Some flickered late into the night, over ale mugs, whispered secrets, and stolen kisses. Despite limited lighting and social expectations, medieval people still found ways to enjoy the night, especially in cities and on feast days. Taverns stayed open well past sunset, particularly in market towns and along trade roads. Inns served food, drink, and stories. The wealthy hosted evening banquets with minstrels and dice games. And young lovers? Well, the dark was full of opportunities. In cities like Paris and London, curfews were officially enforced. Bells rang at dusk to signal lights out and the closing of gates. But enforcement was inconsistent. Where there were wine jugs and fiddle players, the party often continued behind closed shutters. And even in the smallest hamlets, there were weddings, midsummer bonfires, saints' feasts, and harvest dances, many of which stretched far into the night. The medieval calendar was filled with feast days, and each one brought revelry. Carnival, May Day, Epiphany, and countless saints' vigils were all excuses to gather, and gathering often meant drinking. A 13th century French poem describes youths dancing with bare feet in the mud by moonlight, while a German preacher complained that no woman is safe past matins during festivals. Some of the merriment was innocent. Some of it was decidedly not. Clergy often warned against night walking, a euphemism for wandering the streets seeking vice. Brothels did much of their business after sundown. So did pickpockets and highway robbers. Still, for many, these nighttime gatherings weren't immoral. They were liberating. The dark softened class boundaries. A servant girl might dance with a mason's apprentice. A shoemaker might sing like a noble. And for a few hours, sleep could wait. Let's paint a scene. It's midsummer, in a small English town circa 1375. A tavern creaks under the weight of a dozen laughing locals. Inside, a fire blazes, ale sloshes into wooden mugs. A travelling fiddler saws at his strings, playing a lively tune. Two young men stomp their feet while a barmaid spins, cheeks flushed. In a back corner, dice clatter, coins pass hands. A farmer leans back, head tilted in joy or drink, maybe both. Outside, down a quiet lane, two lovers whisper near the well. They'll be scolded if caught. But for now, the world is theirs. The air smells of smoke, rosemary, sweat, and spilled cider. It's midnight, and no one wants to go home yet. These moments didn't make it into official chronicles, but they filled the lives of everyday people. Not everyone went to bed early. Not every night was sacred. Sometimes, sleep was postponed for joy, and that's just as human. In the modern world, we often sacrifice sleep for productivity, but in the Middle Ages, it was sometimes sacrificed for celebration, for community, music, indulgence, and release. And maybe that's worth remembering, because while the medieval night was filled with fears and rituals, it also held laughter, music, kisses behind doors, and the warm haze of ale shared among friends. Even in the Middle Ages, not all good things happened before bedtime. What did it feel like to wake up in 1382? No alarm clocks, no sunlight streaming through double-glazed windows, just the chill of dawn, the creak of timber, and the press of another long day ahead. For most people in the Middle Ages, waking up was not a jarring event. No blaring alarms, no morning shows, no snooze buttons. Instead, it was usually a slow emergence, stirred by natural light, animal noises, or the duties of daily life pressing in. In urban monasteries, the first bell of lauds could ring as early as 4 a.m., calling monks from their thin beds into stone halls to chant morning prayers. In villages, roosters crowed with consistency that was almost sacred. Farmers stirred as early as sunlight allowed, especially in warmer seasons, when more daylight meant more time to work. Children were shaken awake by parents. Hearth fires were coaxed back to life. If you were lucky, there was bread left over from the day before. If not, someone had to start baking. And no matter how poorly you slept, the day waited for no one. There were few comforts in a medieval morning. For starters, it was cold. Most homes had lost all heat from the hearth overnight. Breath came in foggy puffs. Toes met icy floorboards or packed dirt. Water in basins might be half frozen. You didn't shuffle to the bathroom. You may have stepped outside into a cold privy or simply behind the house. If you were in a castle, you might have a chamber pot or a designated garderobe. But that didn't make it any more comfortable. Washing one's face or hands was done with frigid water from a bucket, splashed on the cheeks to shock the senses awake. Soap, if it existed, was rough and homemade, lye-based, often harsh on the skin. There was no coffee, no tea, not even clean water in many places. Some households began their day with small beer weakly fermented, safer than water. Others drank warm broth or day-old porridge, reheated if the fire was generous. Let's follow a typical morning for a cobbler in York, circa 4:45 a.m. He's nudged awake by the sound of a distant church bell. He groans his back sore from straw-stuffed bedding. 5 a.m. The small fire has burned low. His wife is already layering on wool to check on the chickens. 5:10 a.m. He slips into yesterday's tunic, now slightly damp from the cold. He stretches and winces. He slept on a bundle of rope meant for boot repairs. 5:15 a.m. He steps outside. Frost lingers on the eaves. A neighbour waves through the morning mist. 5:30 a.m. A wooden pail of water is brought in. He splashes his face and hands, then blows into them to warm his fingers. 5:45 a.m. A prayer is whispered, just a short one. Eyes half open, and then it's time to light the forge. This wasn't a moment of peace. It was a moment of momentum. It's tempting to think of the medieval morning as bleak, and perhaps, in many ways, it was. But there's also something deeply grounding in how the day began. No noise, no rush, no scrolling through headlines, just the body, the cold, and the immediate tasks of life. And while many mornings began with grumbling, others began with rituals of gratitude. A candle lit before a saint's icon, a shared crust of bread, a quiet lookout at the rising fog over fields or rooftops. People knew the value of a new day because they hadn't been promised one. The sun creeping through cracked shutters wasn't just light, it was permission to begin again. Today, we toss back the duvet and maybe make the bed. But in the Middle Ages, your bedding wasn't just where you slept. It was a communal space, a financial asset, and occasionally a family heirloom. We tend to see a bed as a private object. In the medieval world, it was anything but. For common folk, a household might have only one bed, or perhaps none at all, just bundles of straw, shared among the family and sometimes the livestock. But for those who did have proper beds, they were treated as important pieces of furniture, often the most expensive items a person owned. Beds were listed in wills, passed from parent to child. A bed with all its linens might be a prized wedding gift, or a dowry contribution. And yes, it was common to inherit not just the frame, but the mattress, bedding, curtains, and feather bolster lice and all. After rising in the morning, the bed was not simply abandoned. It was tended to in ways both practical and ritualistic. Let's talk about hygiene. Straw mattresses weren't just uncomfortable. They collected moisture, sweat, fleas, and filth. Left alone, they could grow moldy or foul-smelling. So, even in poorer homes, it was important to air out the bedding during the day. This meant lifting and shaking the straw sacks, or just the straw itself, if it wasn't sewn in, beating dust out of blankets and furs with sticks or paddles, turning over the mattress if it had been soaked with sweat or worse, propping up pillows and bolsters near the fire or window to air out. In wealthier homes, servants or maids performed these duties. In monasteries, novices had designated tasks: straightening bed linens, removing pests, ensuring nothing unholy had crept between the covers. Sometimes, especially in the summer, entire beds were dragged outside into the sun straw sacks hung over wooden railings, blankets flung across low shrubs or scaffolds. The sun was their disinfectant, fresh air, their Febreze. But there's more. Remember that beds were shared, not just overnight but over time. If you were sick, your bed might be visited frequently by family, clergy, or even neighbors bringing soup. You weren't tucked away in isolation. People sat on your bed, prayed beside it, laid babies on it. When travelers visited, especially in poorer homes, your bed might become their bed for the night. You'd sleep elsewhere, on a bench, or next to the fire. Even inns practiced a bed rotation system. The moment one guest rose, another might take their place, no cleaning in between. In some busy hostels, a single bed could host 4 different people across one night and day cycle. Merchant, soldier, student, and drunkard, each curled up against the lingering warmth of the last. Cleanliness was a luxury. Space, even more so. In modern life, a bed is seen as intimate and private, an extension of ourselves. But in the Middle Ages, it was more like a shared stage, passed between users, cleaned ritually, and cherished generationally. And because beds were expensive, they were treated with respect, repaired, maintained, named in wills like jewels or land. They weren't just where you slept, they were where you were born, gave birth, healed, wept, and died. Your bed witnessed everything. Perhaps that's why people prayed before entering it, not just for protection, but in recognition that this humble pile of linen and straw carried so much of life in its frame. Even long after you were gone, your bed might still serve, still comfort, still carry dreams, not your own. In the Middle Ages, where you slept said as much about you as how. A mattress on the floor, a curtained canopy, a spot in the rafters. Let's explore how architecture shaped rest and revealed your place in the world. The idea of a bedroom, a private space designated solely for sleeping, didn't exist for most people in medieval Europe. For peasants and lower-class workers, the bed was simply a section of the main room. A single-chamber cottage might contain a hearth, a workbench, a loom, a cradle, a chicken, and somewhere in the corner, a bed. This bed was usually tucked away in a draft-free nook near the hearth for warmth, or beneath a lofted ceiling beam. Curtains? Rare. Walls? Forget it. Children, siblings, and even neighbors might all sleep within the same visual and acoustic space, separated only by blankets or furniture. Privacy was a dream for another century. In castles, manors, and monasteries, things were a little different but not always more comfortable. Let's start with the Great Hall, the main communal space in many noble homes. Servants, guards, and guests often slept right there on the floor, rolling out bedding after dinner and packing it away before dawn. Think of it as the medieval version of a fold-out couch in a crowded Airbnb. The lord and lady of the house, however, had their own chamber, a room with a bed, often raised off the ground, surrounded by thick curtains on all four sides. These canopy beds weren't just elegant, they were functional. Curtains blocked drafts, crucial in stone buildings with poor insulation. They provided a rare sense of privacy, even within shared living quarters. They helped retain body heat, turning the space under the canopy into a cozy microclimate. In monasteries, monks slept in dormitory-style halls, rows of beds or pallets, with almost no separation. Silence was required. Lights were minimal, and the walls echoed with the sound of coughing, praying, and shuffling feet. Space dictated not just where, but how high one slept. In peasant homes with limited square footage, children might climb into lofts' small sleeping platforms built into the rafters above the main room. The warmth from the hearth rose upward, making it a surprisingly strategic spot. Plus, you were out of the way of adults, livestock, and midnight feet. These lofts weren't full second stories, more like crawl spaces reached by ladder. Cozy, yes. Cramped, also yes. But for many families, it was the only place children could sleep with even a semblance of privacy. In cities, apprentices and servants often slept above shops or kitchens, on narrow wooden platforms. The air was filled with smells: baking bread, drying leather, boiling soap, but the rent was free. And in wealthier homes, a bed might be elevated onto a dais, with tapestries lining the chamber walls. This wasn't just about luxury, it was status on display. A visitor might wait outside while the lord lounged, semi-dressed, within his chamber of rest. When we think about beds, we usually think about comfort. But in the Middle Ages, the location of your sleeping place revealed far more than your sleep habits. It told others how much money you had, whether you were allowed privacy, if you lived with livestock or lords, if your rest was considered sacred or expendable. To sleep high up, curtained, and alone was a luxury. To sleep near the fire, underfoot, or by the door was a necessity. And yet, across every stratum of society, people found ways to make it work, to carve out little havens under thatched roofs, behind hanging cloths, inside shared dormitories, spaces that felt just enough like home to dream inside. Today, we lie on memory foam and hypoallergenic down. But in the Middle Ages, you might have been curled up on straw, feathers, dried leaves, or something much stranger. For most people in the medieval world, buying a mattress wasn't an option. You made your own or inherited one that had seen better centuries. The most common material? Straw. Not fluffy, cartoon farm bale straw, but long, coarse stalks of wheat or barley left over after harvest. People stuffed them into sacks, usually of linen or canvas, creating what was called a pallet or a straw tick. Over time, the straw flattened, mildewed, and had to be replaced, often seasonally or during major house cleanings. But that was just the baseline. Depending on wealth and location, bedding could be filled with hay, softer than straw but smellier when wet, rushes, bulrush, or sweet flag, often mixed with herbs to mask odors, moss, feathers, down, or even shredded wool rags. In rare cases, leaves, bracken, or coarse cloth scraps. And yes, some beds had multiple layers, a straw tick for structure, then a softer feather pad or wool-stuffed bolster laid over top. Feather beds were the medieval gold standard of comfort, but also a serious status symbol. To fill even a small feather mattress, you needed hundreds of birds, usually goose, duck, or swan feathers, plucked over time, often as part of household chores. Poorer families might collect feathers, slowly reusing them from butchered birds, sometimes saving them over years to create a modest pillow. Wealthier families could afford full feather mattresses, which were plump, warm, and unfortunately magnets for vermin. Mice, fleas, and lice found these soft nests very agreeable. To keep pests at bay, people aired bedding regularly in sunlight, hung mattresses on walls during the day, smoked beds with herbs or incense, placed sprigs of lavender, mint, or wormwood between layers. And even then, you still might be woken by itching. A well-made bed in a moderately well-off home might be composed of 1. A straw mattress for height and insulation. 2. A wool-stuffed overlay, providing modest softness. 3. A linen sheet rarely washed, mostly protective. 4. A feather, bolster or pillow passed down through the family. 5. Several blankets or furs, sometimes even old cloaks. Everything was heavy, scratchy, lived in. Beds weren't plush retreats. They were functional constructions, assembled and dismantled as needed. In winter, people slept in their cloaks under blankets. In summer, they sometimes removed the upper layer altogether and slept directly on the rush mats. Blankets, too, varied. Wool was common, but the poor might use sacking cloths or worn-out tunics. The wealthy might boast imported Flemish wool or fur throws, trimmed in embroidery, or dyed in rich blues and reds. The medieval bed wasn't sterile. It was organic, literally alive, with material, straw that creaked, feathers that shed, furs that retained heat and odour. Beds breathed, they rotted, they softened and hardened over time. They absorbed sweat, tears, stories. In a way, they were companion objects tended to, maintained, occasionally cursed, and constantly shared. And maybe they made people more tolerant of discomfort, more adaptable. If your bed itched, you scratched. If it squeaked, you shifted. If it smelled, you turned over and went back to sleep. Compared to our pristine modern sleep culture, it may seem primitive, but there's something beautifully honest in lying down atop what the earth and the barn gave you, and still managing to dream. Why did medieval people pray before bed, like they were preparing to die? Because, to them, sleep wasn't just rest. It was something sacred, symbolic, and maybe even terrifying. In medieval thought, sleep and death were closely intertwined, not just metaphorically, but spiritually. The Latin term, somnus est imago mortis, sleep is the image of death, was a common phrase among theologians and philosophers. And why not? In both sleep and death, the body becomes still, the eyes close. The soul, they believed, goes somewhere else. This wasn't just poetic. It was doctrine. St. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, and countless other writers drew connections between nightly slumber and the eternal rest of the grave. For a medieval Christian, each night's rest was a trial run for the soul. That's why bedtime prayers often included lines like, "If I shall not wake, O Lord, take me into thy mercy." And every time you woke up in the morning, it was a kind of resurrection. Sleep had a surprisingly complex theology. According to many church teachings, sleep could be holy, when used for dreams, divine visions, or spiritual restoration; sinful, when indulged in too much, especially during daylight; dangerous, when it made you vulnerable to demonic visitation or spiritual attack. That's why many bedtime rituals involved acts of confession, the sign of the cross, and appeals to guardian angels. The act of sleep was not taken lightly. It wasn't casual. It was a moment to make peace with God, just in case you didn't wake up. Some religious orders even practiced sleep deprivation as a form of penance. Denying the body rest was seen as an act of spiritual discipline, a way to imitate Christ's suffering. Others emphasized dreams as messages from the divine, but only if you were worthy enough to receive them. Let's imagine a medieval nun preparing for sleep in her stone cell, circa 1290. She kneels at her straw pallet, hands clasped, reciting the compline, the last prayer service of the day. Her candle flickers low. She touches her forehead, chest, and shoulders in the sign of the cross. She whispers, "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." Then, she lies down fully dressed, on a wooden board covered in a thin blanket. She closes her eyes, believing that this might be her last night. and that sleep, if she's lucky, will be only temporary. To her, and to many others, sleep wasn't simply the absence of consciousness. It was a moral moment, a spiritual threshold. Today, we often ignore sleep's deeper meanings. We track it, hack it, treat it like a productivity tool. But in doing so, we've lost something sacred, something the medieval world remembered each night, that when you lie down, you let go of the world, you relinquish control, you trust that the sun will rise again, that your body will still be breathing, that your soul, if such a thing exists, will return home. The medieval mind wasn't afraid to honor that mystery, to pray into it, to give it shape and meaning. Yes, sleep was physical, but it was also cosmic, a rehearsal for the end, a hope for waking, a whisper into the void, and maybe a kind of faith. While peasants slept in straw and shadows, the rich slumbered beneath silks, beside servants, and under carved wooden canopies the size of wagons. In the Middle Ages, how you slept told the world who you were. For medieval nobility, the bed was more than a place to sleep. It was a status symbol, a power statement, a stage. Beds were massive, ornate, and expensive. Often the most valuable item in the household, second only to land. We're talking frames carved from oak, walnut, or imported hardwoods, posts tall enough to touch the ceiling, supporting layers of embroidered curtains, feather mattresses stuffed until plump and buoyant, sheets made from bleached linen or silk, sometimes perfumed with rosewater or lavender, covers embroidered with family crests, religious motifs or gold thread, bolsters, pillows, and bed rugs in multiple layers. The truly wealthy even had tester beds with a wooden canopy and heavy drapes on all sides, creating a cocoon of warmth, privacy, and authority. And these beds weren't hidden away. They were often placed in semi-public rooms, where courtiers or close advisors might visit the lord or lady while reclining. Yes, receiving guests in bed was not unusual. Royal and aristocratic sleep had an audience. Kings, queens, and lords didn't always dress or undress alone. There were bedchamber servants, ladies in waiting, and valets, all part of a carefully choreographed ritual. In the French court, there was even the cérémonie du coucher, the ceremony of going to bed. Attending it was a political privilege. Being allowed to help a monarch into bed signaled proximity to power. The bedtime routine itself could be elaborate. Robes removed by attendants, hands washed in scented water, prayers read aloud by chaplains, a final goblet of wine or herbal draught offered. Even the act of lying down became a public gesture of vulnerability witnessed and controlled. And while the lord might drift into dreams behind thick curtains, his guards stood outside the chamber. His scribe slept nearby. The household waited for the next bell. Sleep, in these circles, was never fully private and never fully yours. Let's visit the chamber of a duchess in 15th century Burgundy. Her bed sits high above the stone floor, raised on a dais, the mattress layered thick with goose down and wool. Curtains hang in heavy folds of crimson damask, tied back with golden cords. A fire crackles nearby. A servant kneels to stir it. The duchess steps into her nightdress, pale linen trimmed in lace. Her maid smooths her long hair, then draws the bed curtains shut. Candles are extinguished one by one. Outside, her lady, in waiting, curls up on a smaller bed or rug nearby just in case she's needed. The chamber quiets, but never entirely. Even in sleep, the duchess remains surrounded, guarded, and watched. The noble bed was an echo of the throne, elevated, visible, and ceremonial. To sleep in such grandeur wasn't just about comfort. It was about reinforcing social order. While peasants woke with straw in their hair, the rich rose from perfumed linen, their dreams bracketed by silk and silver. And yet, sleep levels us all, whether wrapped in fur or lying on moss. The human body must rest. The mind must wander. The soul if you believe in such things, must drift. So perhaps the irony of the noble bed is this: for all its splendor, it couldn't protect anyone from bad dreams, loneliness, or fear of death. The same prayers were whispered beneath gold-threaded sheets as on a peasant's pallet, because in the dark, we all return to the same place. What happened when the bed was ready? The candles out, the prayers whispered, and sleep still didn't arrive. In the Middle Ages, restlessness was as old as the straw mattress itself, while the term insomnia didn't appear in English until the 17th century. The experience of sleeplessness was well known in medieval life. Chronic sleeplessness was described with terms like wakeful mind, the night fret, no rest in the limbs, wandering thoughts that pierce the soul. Writers and physicians recorded cases of people lying awake for hours, plagued by sorrow, pain, or excessive thought. One 14th century monk describes a rest that has no softness, and another writes of turning like a fish upon hot coals. Sleep was understood to be a balance of the humours, especially black bile, linked to melancholy, and choler, heat, and agitation. When these were out of order, the mind could not calm, and the body could not rest. Even then, people knew the cruel paradox of exhaustion with no relief. Medieval scholars and physicians proposed many causes for sleeplessness. 1. Excess heat in the brain due to anger, overthinking, or spicy food. 2. Melancholy or grief thought to cool the blood and drag the soul into sadness. 3. Too much wine, which might initially cause drowsiness but disrupt deep sleep. 4. A bad bed or poor air circulation, especially in crowded towns or smoky huts. 5. Sin or guilt as spiritual unrest prevented the soul from finding peace. But most of all, sleep was seen as something you had to earn physically and morally. A lazy man, it was believed, might sleep too much. A troubled man? Not at all. Some of the earliest sleep hygiene practices were born in medieval herb gardens, apothecaries, and religious texts. Here are a few of the gentle and sometimes strange remedies used to coax the mind into slumber. Herbal solutions. Poppy syrup, a mild sedative made from opium poppy heads, mixed with honey or wine. Valerian root, steeped into tea or dried under the pillow. Chamomile and lavender, crushed and wrapped into sachets tucked beneath the bedclothes. Mugwort, hung above the bed to calm dreams and protect against evil night visitors. Night draughts, warm milk with nutmeg, believed to balance humours and settle the gut. Spiced wine with cloves and cinnamon, sipped slowly by firelight. Cider boiled with mint, used in both humble homes and monasteries. Spiritual practices, late-night prayers, recited slowly, almost like meditation. The repetition of psalms was often used as a mental rhythm to calm anxious thoughts. Confession before bed, to unburden the soul and ease guilt, induced wakefulness. Holy relics under the pillow, or touching a rosary during restless hours. Physical adjustments, warm stones wrapped in cloth placed at the feet. Changing the sleeping direction to face east rather than west. Airings of the bedding between first and second sleep, believing that fresh linens could invite the soul to rest. Still, for some, nothing worked. The night stretched endlessly, with no remedy but to wait, whether lying in a grand curtained bed or on straw in a smoky cottage. There have always been nights when sleep simply won't come. The Middle Ages didn't have answers, not really, but they had stories, rituals, remedies, a quiet hope that tomorrow would be easier. And maybe there's something comforting in that, to know that long before blue light and caffeine, long before 24-hour anxiety and clinical diagnoses, people lay under stars and beams, wishing for peace, and learning slowly how to greet the dark. The lesson wasn't to conquer sleeplessness. It was to survive it, to make peace with the long night, and trust that morning would come. Before sleep apps and bedtime podcasts, medieval people turned to stranger solutions. Sleeping with iron scissors under the bed, tying herbs to their ankles, and yes, hiding keys under their tongues. Garlic wasn't just for cooking. It was believed to ward off night spirits, especially incubus demons or witches seeking to harm the sleeper. Some families placed garlic on windowsills, beneath pillows, hung in braids over the bedpost. The smell wasn't loved, but the protection was worth it, especially on feast days when spirits were believed to roam more freely. This bizarre practice shows up in folk texts from both rural England and northern France. The belief was that holding an iron key under your tongue while falling asleep could reveal visions of hidden treasure, protect you from night terrors, or, in some stories, allow you to lock your soul safely inside your body. Some believed the dream would lead you to a buried coin hoard or a lost family heirloom. Others just said it kept the devil out of your mouth. Do not try this at home. Medieval people were deeply suspicious of mirrors, especially at night. It was thought that a mirror could trap your soul while you slept, or worse, reflect spirits visiting your bed. That's why many covered mirrors at night, turned them to the wall, or stored them in chests. This superstition persisted well into the Victorian era, and even shows up in some modern folklore. In rural German traditions, it was said that hopping 3 times clockwise around your bed before lying down would confuse evil spirits, shake off lingering curses, or simply loosen the body's restlessness. The ritual often ended with a whispered phrase such as, "Spirits out, sleep in." Some even added a clove of garlic in their sock for good measure. Beyond placing herbs under the pillow, some folk healers recommended tying little sachets of mugwort, thyme, or elderflower directly to the ankles or wrists. Why? To anchor the soul to the body, to prevent spiritual drifting during dreams, or to attract prophetic visions. The herbs were changed weekly, and some added silver thread to enhance the charm's purity. For those plagued by mental unrest or sleepless grief, many turned to Saint Dymphna, the patron saint of anxiety and disturbed sleep. A common charm was a painted or carved token placed under the mattress. A prayer said nightly, "Dymphna, rest my mind, keep the dark behind." She was particularly invoked by mothers with crying infants, or by those who had nightmares that recurred. Perhaps the strangest of all, in a few scattered records, there are references to nailing down a shadow, usually involving a ritual hammering of an iron nail into the wooden bed frame while saying the sleeper's name. This was believed to prevent sleepwalking, stop the soul from wandering too far, or protect against demonic possession in the night. It may have originated from earlier pagan traditions or merged with Christian exorcism rites over time. While these superstitions may seem strange, even silly, they reflect a powerful truth. Sleep is vulnerability, and for medieval people, that meant finding comfort wherever they could in iron, herbs, ritual, and repetition. They couldn't explain sleep. They couldn't guarantee it. But they could prepare for it, protect it, and pass down their knowledge, no matter how odd it seemed. And perhaps that's not so different from today. And now, dear listener, our journey is nearly complete. We've wandered through the smoky halls of medieval night, tucked into straw beds, whispered prayers beneath flickering candles, and listened to the sounds of sleep across centuries. All that remains now is to rest. So here we are. The fire has long since gone to embers. The shutters are closed. The straw has settled. You've walked the full circle of a medieval night, from the first yawn at sunset to the final dream before dawn. You've lain beside peasants in haylofts, nobles behind velvet curtains, and monks beneath cold stone arches. You've smelled the smoke of the hearth, heard the creak of old floorboards, felt the tug of heavy wool on tired limbs. You've listened to whispered prayers, drifting thoughts, rustling feathers, and the silence between snores. You've seen how sleep was something earned through work, through ritual, through trust. You've watched a world prepare for rest, not with technology or medication, but with garlic, rosaries, and rhythm. And maybe you've realized, for all our advances, we still long for the same thing: a warm bed, a quiet room, a safe place to close our eyes. Maybe, just maybe, we still carry a little of that medieval soul inside us. lighting a candle in the dark, folding a blanket just so, sighing once before turning over, because in the end, whether in 1325 or today, the night belongs to all of us. And now, you don't have to think anymore. You don't have to turn another page. You don't have to remember where we were. Just breathe. Let the story go blurry at the edges. Let the straw grow softer. Let the stars outside blink once and vanish. Sleep well.